So one of the biggest concerns for sellers regarding contingencies is whether or not the deal will close or fall apart because of the contingency. On the other hand, buyers are concerned about whether or not a contingency will protect their deposit. Well, today we'll address both of those issues as well as the most important issue of how a contingency is removed by the end of today's video. So, I'm Harold Powell. I'm your local real estate agent here in Ventura, and if you want to stay up to date on all things real estate for Ventura and the surrounding areas, well, I suggest hitting the subscribe, like, and bell icon to be notified of future content. So there are several contingencies in the contract, and up until this last year, there were typically 4 common buyer contingencies, but with all the fires here in California, the insurance contingency has really added to our quiver of 5 common contingencies that can cause a transaction to fall apart. So let's address the 5 contingencies. So the first contingency is the inspection contingency. Let's talk a little bit about the actual process. Now, there's no question your home is going to be combed over with a fine-tooth comb considering today's home inspections. Typically, the inspection contingency time frame is going to run from 10 to 17 days, and the inspection period allows for the buyer to evaluate all aspects and systems of the property, and the sellers need to realize that the buyers really haven't fully committed to purchase the property yet, even though the buyers have a deposit of earnest money on the property, but it is fully refundable. So if they don't like what they see or can't come to terms on repairs, they can still back out and get their full deposit returned. Most sellers would love to sell as is, but the reality is the buyer often has no idea as to what the condition of many of the different aspects of the home until the property is fully inspected. Now, once the home inspection is complete, the buyer really has 3 options. Number 1 is to move forward with the sale as is. Number 2, which is the most common, request repairs, a credit for repairs, or a price reduction in lieu of repairs. The third is cancel the contract if the issues are just too big to overlook or for the buyer to even deal with. Now, while the inspection contingency does not obligate the seller to do repairs that are not agreed to upfront in the purchase, we do recommend the sellers be open to negotiate repair requests that are reasonable. And being open to being reasonable can help keep the deal moving forward to a successful close. Now, the second contingency is the appraisal contingency. This will often be the next contingency that the buyer will remove, and the appraisal contingency typically is around 17 days. So ideally, the appraiser should go out to the property within, let's say, the first 10 days to be able to have the appraisal back to the lender before day 17. Now, the most often asked question by a seller and buyer is, what if the appraisal doesn't come in at sales price? Now, if this does happen, then this can be a negotiated item. A seller can ask the buyer to make up the difference. Of course, if the buyer doesn't have it or doesn't want to pay more than the appraisal value, then the seller has to decide to either accept the appraisal value or cancel the transaction. Now, this is why a cash buyer is probably the most attractive to a seller, since there is no appraisal contingency, and a buyer with a down payment of 25% or more will also be attractive, since they will at least have the ability to gap the appraisal contingency if they choose to. Moving on to the loan contingency. The loan contingency is typically removed by day 17, and this time frame is used by the lender to verify the buyer's income, credit, and funds needed to close the escrow. And the lender will also be reviewing, let's say, any solar leases, possible HOA information, and the title report to ensure financing for underwriter approval. If the buyer was pre-approved rather than pre-qualified, this means the buyer had desktop underwriter approval, which means when they submitted the offer, the chances of them being approved is highly likely. So the fourth contingency is the home insurance contingency. Now, in the past, this insurance contingency was pretty much an afterthought, given just how easy it was to be able to obtain home insurance. But with all the past and recent fires, it has become a hot issue. The key issue here is to speak with 2 or possibly 3 insurance agents up front, especially if you are considering a home that is in potentially a high or very high severity zone. It may take 2 or 3 weeks for the insurance to even get approved, and can often become the last contingency that a buyer removes due to all the delays. The last and 5th potential contingency is the contingency of either closing or the contingency of selling a home. Now, most sellers don't have a problem with the contingency of closing, but the contingency of selling the home is really not very attractive to most home sellers. The sellers are essentially taking their home off the market to wait for the buyer to sell their home. So, as a seller, you are at the mercy of the buyer's ability to sell their home, and if they can't sell their home, then you can't sell your home either. For that reason, most of the sellers I represent will ask that the buyer come back with an offer after they have their property in escrow. Now, since we don't know just how long it will take to actually sell that property, you have to ask yourself, well, what if you missed out on a non-contingent buyer that would have purchased your home but can't, since you are stuck with a buyer that can't sell their property? And maybe further still, wouldn't be able to even lower their price. That can be a big problem. Now, the contingency of closing is not without problems, since the buyer of that property can also back out of the transaction due to the contingencies that they have in place. Now, needless to say, the more contingencies that have been removed on that buyer's property, the more likely your deal will also close. All right, as I mentioned, probably one of the most important and misunderstood elements about contingencies for buyer and seller is to really understand how they are released by the buyer. Now, the buyer's contingency only gets removed when the buyers remove it in writing. The buyer's contingency does not expire on the actual due date. If a home buyer has not provided in writing a release for their contingency by the due date, the seller can sign a notice to perform, which gives the buyer 3 days to remove the contingency from receipt. Now, if the buyers don't remove it by day 3 of giving the notice, then the seller has the option to cancel the transaction if they want. At this point, this is really the only recourse the seller has in order to cancel the transaction, and the buyer's deposit will be returned to the buyer since they did not remove their contingency. So for the sellers, every time a buyer removes a contingency, they are really eliminating a potential reason that a buyer could potentially cancel the contract, and one step closer to a successful close. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If so, give it a thumbs up. Thanks.